This is the All About 80s Music podcast with John Micek and Steve Augello.
Hey, this is Steve Augello, and I'm here with John Micek.
How's it going, Steve?
Going well, John. The 80s were a colorful, fun decade full of big hair, crazy personalities, rad attitudes, and gibberish catchphrases, and the music was a diverse reflection of that culture. Join us as we discuss some of the zaniest novelty songs that came out of the greatest decade. This is going to be a lot of fun, so let's not waste any time and get right to it. So, John, we've talked before about curveballs being thrown into 80s music and how they were not only accepted by the public, but in many cases became number one hits that sold millions of copies. Think about how radio was shaken up by instrumentals, acapellas, songs in different languages, duets sung by unlikely duos, and then there were the novelty songs that were quickly created to cash in on a popular catchphrase, dance, TV personality, video game, and anything else you could think of. Before we dive into our list, I'd like to get your initial thoughts on some of the novelty songs that were released in the decade that brought us Weird Al, Max Headroom, and Mojo Nixon.
You know, Steve, the novelty songs of the 1980s were the inheritors to the novelty songs of decades past. You can trace them all the way through the recorded history of pop music, from Spike Jones and his City Slickers in the 1940s with songs like Dip for Her Face and Hawaiian War Chant, through to the 1950s with Beep Beep by the Playmates, and into the 60s with They're Coming to Take Me Away and the Monster Mash, through the Convoy of the 1970s and Basketball Jones by Cheech and Chong and Shaving Cream by Benny Bell. But Steve, the 1980s were a fertile time. The decade that gave us the New Romantics, New Wave, and Live Aid also gave us our fair share of slightly embarrassing things like huge shoulder pads, mullets, and marble wash jeans. And by God, Steve, novelty songs were right in there. Some of them coming from fast food tie-ins, television shows, cartoons, the minds of some truly creative and maybe a little twisted people, just extraordinary. And I know this discussion is going to be a whole lot of fun.
It certainly is, and that was all beautifully said. Who's first on your list of greatest novelty songs of the 80s?
Steve, I'm going with Billy Crystal and You Look Marvelous. The listeners will remember in the 1980s, one of Crystal's most famous recurring sketches on Saturday Night Live was his parody of Fernando Lamas, a smarmy talk show host whose catchphrase was, "You look marvelous," became a media sensation. Due to the success of that, he released in 1985, released an album of stand-up material called Marvelous. And the title track, You Look Marvelous, was written by Crystal and Paul Schaefer, who was at one point the SNL band leader and, of course, was the band leader for David Letterman for so many years. Both the song and the video feature Crystal in character as his SNL persona, features him cruising around in the world's longest stretch limousine surrounded by models and bikinis. You know, the song peaked at number 58 on the Billboard Hot 100 in the U.S. and number 17 in Canada. The album was nominated for a Grammy for Best Comedy Recording at the 1986 Grammy Awards. Steve, Billy Crystal was one of those great comedians of the 1980s. He was seemingly everywhere, still working to this day, kind of a Mr. Showbiz, really just tireless.
You know, this song from 1985 was during what I call the golden era of Saturday Night Live. That was when Eddie Murphy and Joe Piscopo were on. Don Pardo was the announcer and G.E. Smith was the musical director. I remember waiting each week for, Billy's Fernando Lamas skit with his famous catchphrase to come on. All of us kids threw that catchphrase around so much it became a daily thing for a while. This song was so great, and you could tell by listening to it, Paul Schaefer just kind of gave him the track to kind of do his shtick over. Songs like Rappin' Rodney had more of a legit song structure and a memorable tune. But Billy's single was just a great accompaniment to his catchphrase and just a great piece of memorabilia from our childhood.
All right, Steve, what's your first pick?
All right, so I'm coming at you full force here with this one. It's Where's the Beef by Coyote McCloud, featuring Clara Peller. I'm sure you know Clara Peller's name by now. For those of you who remember, in January of 1984, Wendy's started running a series of commercials featuring three old ladies, and one of them, Clara Peller, kept asking in her unique voice, "Where's the beef?" And that catchphrase blew up so big, and for the next year, you heard "Where's the beef" being quoted on a daily basis all over the place. It was used on all kinds of merch, from Frisbees to bumper stickers to hats, and there was a song. The track was concocted by a dude named Coyote McLeod, who was a popular local DJ in Nashville. It featured his voice talking over the music along with samples of Clara saying her catchphrase. It was ridiculous, but it was a catchy tune. And you can sort of hear hints of Rappin' Rodney in the music and the background vocal melodies. I had to dig to find this one, Micek, but I knew it was out there because in the 80s, you can always count on someone quickly cashing in on a catchphrase that went big, and there were just so many of them. A testament to the lingo and the talk of the gnarliest generation ever. So many rad slangs and sayings that have stayed with us to this day. Ridiculously awesome.
Steve, this one had the benefit of reminding me that the phrase "where's the beef" existed. As you're right, it was just everywhere in 1984. I'm sure we probably said it to our friends way back when as well. This one sparked, in addition to all of the other swag, a Milton Bradley board game, of all things. You can probably track that on eBay if you're particularly determined. In 2011, Wendy's revived the phrase for a new ad campaign, finally answering its own question with Steve. Here's the beef. But you're right. This one's a deep cut. I forgot that this song existed until we started doing the research for this show. Just a weird, brief glimmer on the pop charts, and still brings a smile to my face, I have to admit.
And that's why we love the 80s so much. What's on your list?
Steve, I'm going to Shut Up You Face, the 1980 hit single by the artist Joel Doce, released under the name of the Joel Doce Music Theater. He said he wrote this one as kind of a nod to his Italian roots and the broken English that his nonna and grandpa and all of his other relations spoke as when they came over from the old country. If you were an Italian-American kid, Steve, growing up in the 1980s, as you and I were, we heard this song. It was probably played on Sunday afternoons while we were waiting for the sauce to get done and the pasta to be put on the table. It's just one of those things I remember from sort of my very early middle school years. And I don't know, it's weird, it just popped up on the radio like not too long ago. I forget where I heard it. It might have been Absolute Radio in the UK. It had been the first time in, 30-something years that I heard the song, and it all just came rushing back in a flood. And when we started talking about doing this novelty song podcast, Steve, I knew we had to include this one. Weirdly enough, it was covered in other languages as well. You wouldn't think an Italian folk song would translate well into Czech or German or Belgian, but there you go.
Joe went international with it. Hey,
yep, sure did.
Entrepreneur in the music business back in 1980. And I tell you, as a first-generation Italian, I can confirm that this is one of the staples of Italian party music, along with Dominic the Donkey, Ti Amo, and the Chicken Dance, and a bunch of others. And what a great song to kick off the 1980s. I know it broke tons of records internationally, like you said. It was a #1 hit in a bunch of countries, and it's still being played at weddings and communions and anniversary parties and any other Italian get-together you could think of. It's really part of the public consciousness now, and it's been handed off to the new generations of young Italians, and it will probably never go away. And it'll probably live forever among Italian Americans, along with the recent pinched finger emoji that's out there now. A bunch of Italians actually lobbied for it and got it as an emoji, and now we're using it. And
that was briefly a TikTok meme as well, with Louis Prima playing in the background. You know you're Italian when, and to the sauce cellar and the Italian and the Catholic iconography in your grandmother's house. It's a very Italian thing, Steve. It's a very, very Italian thing.
Just another win for us Italian Americans. So
absolutely. Great. What's your next pick?
So I'm going with probably one of my favorite novelty songs from the 80s, and that is Rappin' Rodney from 1983. This is the main one for me. In the 70s, you know, Rodney Dangerfield was a constant presence on TV, doing his shtick on Johnny Carson, Ed Sullivan, Jackie Gleason, Dean Martin, right? And in the 80s, his career surged as he was responsible for 3 of the best movies, as far as I'm concerned: Caddyshack, Easy Money, and Back to School. But in 1983, he ventured into the music scene, releasing his hit single, Rappin' Rodney. I was 12 years old in 83, and after hearing the song on Z100 and seeing the video on MTV, I immediately bought the entire album. I just had to do it. I skipped the 45, went straight to the album because it was so good. And as I remember it, the Rappin' Rodney song was on the album, but then it was just like an hour or so of stand-up. But the cool thing was the video. It was an extremely funny song. The video was equally as zany as you could see. Pat Benatar, Father Guido Sarducci, and a few other celebrities had spots on the video there. But thanks to Rodney for contributing this classic. It was actually a nice accompaniment to so many Weird Al songs that were dominating the airwaves in the 80s. Just awesome.
Yeah, Steve, we're talking about Italian Americans. You bring up the late Don Novello, who brought Father Guido Sarducci to life on Saturday Night Live, a probably borderline blasphemous, heretical character. But if you grew up Catholic like we did and Italian, you recognized it right away. This one was another one, Steve, where I had to go back and scour the memory banks for Rappin' Rodney. I knew that it existed, but again, had not heard it in years and years until we started doing the research for this podcast. You know, Steve, you go back into the 1980s and you realize what a huge impact that Rodney Dangerfield had on that explosion of stand-up comedy in the 1980s. He had his comedy club, Dangerfield. He presented the Rodney Dangerfield Comedy Half Hour on HBO. Broke so many comedians: Sam Kinison, Bobcat Goldthwait, Stephen Wright, Gary Shandling. So many people who became part of the comedic landscape in the 1980s. People are sort of like legends of their time. Maybe younger listeners don't know who they are now, but it's hard to sort of explain just how massive comedians were in the 1980s. They were the rock stars of their time. You kind of had pop music happening on one side, you had that explosion of stand-up happening on the other, and you had Rodney Dangerfield standing astride both.
And I agree with you. The 80s was such a great decade. There were so many comedians on TV all the time. It was just a great decade to have fun and laugh. And I don't think we laugh enough anymore.
You probably couldn't tell some of those jokes these days, but yes, we laughed quite a lot.
What's up next?
Steve, now this was the one that actually sent me down the rabbit hole for wanting to do this podcast in the first place, or this episode of the podcast in the first place. I'm going with the Curly Shuffle by Jump in the Saddle, a novel song written by Chicago-based singer and musician Peter Quinn as an homage to the great Three Stooges film comedy team, initially recorded by his Jump in the Saddle band and released in 1983. The timing of the recording nearly coincided with the Stooges receiving their star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame on August 30th, 1983. This went to number 15 in the U.S. Billboard charts. It went number 29 in Canada. Both the original version and the Jump in the Saddle band were released in Australia. Speaking to the international appeal, Steve, of the Three Stooges and this very sort of silly swing music song, you'll remember the video. It was intercut with footage of the Three Stooges shorts. And Steve, to bring it back around, because everything comes back around to Italian Americans, I remember watching the Three Stooges with my grandfather Lorenzo, who came over from the old country in 1928. His English wasn't that good, but it didn't matter, Steve, because a frying pan to the face is funny no matter what language you speak. I have a deep affection for the Three Stooges because of, for that very reason, watching it with my nonna so many years ago.
The reason you were probably watching it with your nono back then is because, if I remember correctly, the Three Stooges were on usually on Sundays. And that would be the family time in the 80s, which we don't have a lot of those big family dinners anymore on Sundays like we used to back in the 70s and 80s. I think it's important to mention that back in the 80s, you could still see a lot of those black and white films and shows from the 30s, 40s, and 50s and early 60s. Three Stooges were on, but also I Love Lucy was one of them, Laurel and Hardy.
And we had to tune it in on the UHF dial, Steve, which had the dial within the dial, because we're bringing in like channel 22 from Springfield or channel 40 from Springfield. And you had to position the rabbit ears just right because they didn't have cable at my grandparents' house then. So yes. Steve, your pick.
I'm taking it back to 1982 for a famous one, which I know you'll remember, Micek, PacMan Fever from Bunkner and Garcia. So in the very early 80s, Pac-Man was the dominant arcade game loved by kids across America, and it was so nuts that Ms. Pac-Man would be the consolation second when too many kids had their quarters set to play the next number of rounds on the one Pac-Man machine in the room. Gamers were obsessed and they couldn't get enough, and in 1982, when I was 11, I heard the song Pac-Man Fever by Buckner and Garcia on the radio, and I laughed because it was so apparent that someone finally cashed in on making a song about the game. But even as capitalistic as it was, the song was actually good, especially if you were a 10, 11, 12-year-old boy back then. It became a top 10 hit, selling 1 million copies worldwide immediately. And then by the year 2008, it was awarded 2.5 million copies sold, as the record shows. And it was off the album by the same name, and the entire LP was made up of arcade game songs. There was Do the Donkey Kong, which I believe was the follow-up single.
Yeah, didn't quite land the same way, but yes.
I thought Donkey Kong would be right up there, but they had Hyperspace, which was about asteroids, my favorite game of the decade. Froggy's Lament about Frogger, and there were others. These guys knew what they were doing and cashing in on the market, and it was well received by the kids of the greatest decade. Totally tubular.
So, Steve, in 1981, Buckner and Garcia were jingle writers living in Atlanta, Georgia, doing other low-profile studio work. They were in a restaurant eating dinner one night. They saw kids crowded around the PacMan machine. They'd never played it before. They didn't know what all the fuss was about. They went over there and checked it out and ended up playing the game for 2 hours straight. Think about what they must have pumped in quarters over the course of 2 hours. It's probably their royalty check for their last 5 songs combined. They recorded the novelty tune. The manager shopped at the radio stations. No one really bit down on it until the local WSTR in Atlanta decided to play it for fun on the show one morning. The station was bombarded with calls from listeners demanding to know what the tune was. It took off from there. The rest is pop culture history. I was never much of a Pac-Man guy myself. I loved Defender. I loved Scrambler, those sort of horizontal attack games where you're in a spaceship. But, Steve, like you, 11 or 12 years old, I was in the arcade in my local mall. We biked down on a Saturday afternoon, pockets full of quarters, probably because we'd cashed in soda cans from the house because Connecticut had the 5-cent deposit. So you get enough soda cans together, you got an afternoon of fun. Probably even squeeze in a hot dog from the food court.
And I want to mention that going out to dinner with your parents in the 80s, they'd pick a certain restaurant to go to. Where are we going? Oh, we're going to this restaurant. And you'd be like, okay, they have a Pac-Man game in the lobby. That's great.
Or they had it in the dining room and it was a console table and you had to sit down and then look down at the video game. Yeah,
that's right. And in those days, when you were waiting for your table, the kids would just have their quarters lined up and they'd be like, no, that's my quarter. I'm the third one. Yeah. I got the third, fourth, and fifth game. That was the culture back then.
This was very definitely an artifact of the time. Steve, no list would be complete without a song from the great Weird Al Yankovic. So many to choose from. I'm going with my next one. I could have gone with Eat It. I could have gone with Fat. But Steve, I'm going with Another One Rides the Bus.
Awesome.
It's a February 1981 parody of the Queen hit Another One Bites the Dust. Recorded live on September 14th, 1980 on the great Dr. Demento radio show, which was the place where we all heard these novelty songs for the very first time because we're staying up way too late on a Sunday before school. At least that's when WCCC in Hartford, Connecticut played at like 10 or 11 o'clock on a Sunday night. So I had to really make the effort to stay up late and play my little Radio Shack boombox right in my room so my parents wouldn't hear me listening. Weird Al he was just one of those guys in the 80s who seemed to be everywhere. He's still everywhere even now, touring and recording. He had this one. He had My Bologna. He had Oh Ricky, which is the takeoff of the I Love Lucy show, and all powered by an accordion. Here's a guy, Steve, not in a polka band, who managed to make accordion cool in some weird way.
That's right. And I don't know when you were a kid if you would do the same thing as me. Like every time I heard a song go big on the radio, I would say to myself, "Oh, Weird Al's going to come out with something for this." Mm-hmm. But he was real quick. He would come out with something like a couple of weeks after the release. He was definitely one of the hardest working guys in the 80s, parodying the hell out of the hits, and he was the biggest one out of all of them.
And Steve, you recall he actually had that movie, UHF. We talk about UHF on here. He was like a station manager on a UHF station where all sorts of hilarity ensued. UHF really was the Wild West of 1980s TV because they had the station and they had hours and hours and hours to fill it. And then you would find like the weirdest stuff, like The Blob and 1950s monster movies and Night of the Living Dead. And
it's like we said before, it was the Wild West and anything kind of went, and you could find pretty much anything. If you fine tune those dials in, it was great.
Just right. Steve, what's your pick?
So I'm going with It's Good to Be the King by Mel Brooks. In June of 1981, Mel Brooks' famous movie, History of the World Part 1, was released. And if you had HBO or VCR machine in the early 80s, you had this movie on constant rotation in your house. It was hilarious, and it featured some of the best actors and actresses from the 70s. B. Arthur, Dom DeLuise, Gregory Hines, Madeline Kahn, Cloris Leachman, and a bunch of others. It's Good to Be the King was one of the most famous catchphrases that you would hear in the early 80s. And it's one of the first things that you still think about when people our age think about Mel Brooks. You could find the song, It's Good to Be the King, out there in a few different forms. I think there's a rap as well as a standard version. The song never charted the way PacMan Fever or Rappin' Rodney did. I had to mention it here on our list just because it's so super iconic.
I'm a huge Mel Brooks fan, Steve. His movie, To Be or Not to Be, about Polish resistance fighters in World War II is a classic. Spaceballs, of course, another classic of the 1980s, his parody of the Star Wars films. I had to really scrape the internet to try to find information about this song. There's not a whole lot that's out there, but this was the title of Brooks's memoir, It's Good to Be the King, about his life in show business. He talked in there about maybe his greatest movie of all time, Blazing Saddles, the just insane Western that he said he, quote, wanted to be a surrealist epic. You know, Brooks, Carl Reiner, a very specific kind of old school comedy. Brooks never worked blue, but he was always consistently funny in that sort of like Borscht Belt, very quintessentially 1950s humor kind of way. And this is just another feather in his cap. All right, Steve, I'm going out weird with this one. I'm going out with Fish Heads, the novelty song by the comedy rock duo Barnes and Barnes. First released as a single in 1978 and later featured on their 1980 album Rubaha. It was the most requested song on the Dr. Demento radio show. Its video was in regular rotation on MTV in 1980 because in the early days of MTV had absolutely nothing to play, so they played everything no matter how bizarre it was. So you would see Fish Heads on there. You would see I Want to Be a Lifeguard by Blotto. You'd see The Residents on there, who are those guys in the top hats and the eyeball masks. You know, we all remember singing this one. I'm not going to inflict it on the listeners, but you can talk about roly-poly fish heads and eating them up, yum, and taking your fish heads to the prom. It's a thoroughly surreal piece of pop, but again, very much of its time, and no list of 1980s novelty songs would be complete without it.
I'm familiar with the song too, just because of MTV and them not having a ton of videos in the early 80s. So they would throw a bunch of stuff on throughout the 24-hour period. There were videos that seemed homemade. There were cheaply made live videos that you could tell were shot with the VCR camera. And there was this song, and I loved it because it was so ridiculous. And the video had that little bouncy sing-along ball that was actually, before karaoke got big, there were just sing-alongs. Like in the 50s and 60s, they would do the little bouncy ball so you could sing along with the song at home. And it had that. It was just a really great throwback to the very early 80s and being a kid sitting there watching MTV in 1981, just ridiculously awesome.
Steve, you're getting last word on the show this week. What's your song?
Well, I'm going out big, and I feel this is really appropriate because it is Valley Girl from 1982. Frank Zappa's daughter, Moon Unit Zappa. This was her one and only big hit song. I love this song from the moment I saw it in real time on solid gold, because what it does is it gives you the most 80s slang phrases and tude in one place. It was the only single on Frank Zappa's 1982 album, and it was his only top 40 hit. It was sung by his daughter, Moon Zappa, when she was just 14 years old at the time. Legend has it that he woke her up out of bed in the middle of the night and dragged her to the studio so that she could recreate conversations that she had with her friends over the phone that he would hear. And it was a really good representation of early 80s girls, not only in the San Fernando Valley, like where they lived, but just all over the 80s. You know, they had that lackadaisical attitude, like, yeah, whatever. The song features all those catchphrases all in one place, and I just think it's totally tubular, and what a great snapshot of the early 80s that we all think of when we think of the catchphrases and the lingo and the attitude of that time.
Yeah, Frank Zappa, taken from us entirely too soon, Steve, quite some number of years ago. His kids, though, Dweezil and Moon, you know, they did their thing. They had their moment in the 1980s. This was his, as you say, his most mainstream moment. Nominated for a Grammy Award, the 25th annual Grammys for Best Rock Performance by a Duo or Group. You know, Zappa known for some pretty unconventional songwriting. This was one of perhaps his most conventional songs, written a standard 4/4 time signature. Except, of course, where he couldn't help himself and it broke into a 7/4 time signature at the very end of the tune. Yeah, I mean, this is when sort of Valley speak broke through and went mainstream. We had the TV show Square Pegs on CBS for a hot minute with a very young Sarah Jessica Parker in there, and everyone's, you know, totally tubular, grody man, gagging in the studio, you know, and all the slang we knew so well. There was the Valley Girl movie with Deborah Foreman and a plucky newcomer named Nicolas Cage, also in 1982, kind of critical mass for that Valley Girl subculture. And this is the musical document of the time. All right, that's all the time we have for this week. I'm John. Like, share, subscribe, leave your comments below. Let us know what we missed. Let us know what you want to hear in future shows. We'll be back very, very soon.
And this is Steve saying, until next time, keep it cool, keep it awesome, and keep it totally rad.